June 8, 1942, somewhere over the Soviet southern front. The sound came first, a soft whooshing like wind through fabric. Then, moments before impact, the whistle of falling bombs. By the time German soldiers scrambled from their bunks, it was already too late. Explosions tore through ammunition depots, supply lines, and troop concentrations. And then, as quickly as they had come, the attackers vanished into the darkness. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches. They weren't wrong to be terrified. But what truly haunted the Wehrmacht wasn't just the bombs that rained down night after night. It was the realization that these devastating attacks were being carried out by young women, barely out of their teens, flying wooden canvas biplanes that looked like they belonged in a museum. This is the story of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the most decorated female unit in Soviet military history. It's a story of courage, determination, and survival against impossible odds. It's a story that deserves to be told. October 1941. The German war machine stood at the gates of Moscow. In just 5 months, Operation Barbarossa had torn through Soviet defences like a knife through paper. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, had pushed deep into Soviet territory. The Red Army was reeling. Cities burned. Millions died. The Soviet Union stood on the brink of collapse. In this darkest hour, when every able-bodied man was desperately needed at the front, a letter arrived on Joseph Stalin's desk. It came from Marina Raskova, the Soviet Union's most celebrated female pilot. Her proposal was radical, almost unthinkable. Form dedicated combat units composed entirely of women. Marina Raskova wasn't just any pilot. She was a national hero, the Soviet equivalent of Amelia Earhart. In 1938, she had been part of an all-female crew that set a world record for longest non-stop flight by women, covering over 3,700 miles. When her plane had been forced to make an emergency landing in the Siberian wilderness, Raskova survived 10 days in the frozen taiga before being rescued. Stalin himself had sent search parties to find her. She had proven herself not just skilled, but unbreakable. Now, as her country faced extinction, thousands of Soviet women were volunteering for combat duty. They wanted to fight. They wanted to defend their homeland. But the military bureaucracy had no idea what to do with them. Female pilots, navigators, and mechanics were being turned away or relegated to non-combat roles. It was a waste of talent the Soviet Union could ill afford. Raskova's proposal cut through the red tape. She requested permission to form 3 all-female aviation regiments: fighters, dive bombers, and night bombers. Each would be staffed entirely by women, from the pilots and navigators to the mechanics and armourers. No men, no exceptions. Stalin approved it immediately. On October 8, 1941, Order number 0099 officially authorized the formation of 3 women's aviation regiments. Within weeks, over 2,000 women descended on Engels, a military airfield on the Volga River. They came from every corner of the Soviet Union: factory workers and university students, teachers and engineers, farm girls and ballerinas. Some were experienced pilots. Many had never flown anything in their lives. The youngest was just 15 years old. They came because their country was dying. They came because their brothers, fathers, and husbands were dying. They came because someone needed to fight back. What they didn't know yet was just how dangerous their mission would be, or that the aircraft they would fly were already obsolete when their mothers were children. They didn't know that within 3 years, 23 of them would be named heroes of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honour. And they didn't know that the Germans would come to fear them more than any other night raiders on the Eastern Front. The training began immediately, and it was brutal. Engels airfield in the winter of 1941 was not a place for the weak. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees. The women arrived to find they had been issued men's uniforms, boots several sizes too large, and facilities designed for male soldiers. They stuffed their boots with newspaper and cinched their oversized tunics with belts. They shared cramped barracks with no heating, and they trained. Marina Raskova drove them relentlessly. There was no time for gentle introduction to military life. The front was collapsing. These women needed to be combat-ready in months, not years. They studied navigation, meteorology, aircraft mechanics, and bombing tactics. They learned to service their own planes, load their own bombs, and survive in hostile territory. They drilled until they could perform every task in complete darkness. The Night Bomber Regiment, officially designated the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, would face the steepest challenge. Their aircraft was the Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane so primitive it seemed like a cruel joke. The Po-2 had first flown in 1928 as a training aircraft. It was designed to be simple, forgiving, and cheap to produce. It had an open cockpit, no radio, no guns, and no armour. Its two-seat tandem configuration was made of wood covered with plywood and doped fabric. In strong winds, you could actually see the fabric rippling on the wings. The plane's maximum speed was 94 miles per hour. Its maximum bomb load was just 770 pounds, carried in racks under the lower wings. By 1941, the Po-2 was hopelessly obsolete. Modern German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 could fly 3 times faster and carried multiple machine guns and cannons. The Po-2 was so slow, so fragile, that it seemed suicidal to send them against the Wehrmacht. But Marina Raskova and her commanders saw something others missed. The Po-2's weaknesses could become strengths in the right circumstances. The plane was too slow to show up effectively on radar. Its wooden construction gave it a minimal radar signature anyway. It could fly low, hugging the terrain, appearing and disappearing in valleys and tree lines. Its engine was incredibly quiet compared to modern bombers. Most importantly, the Po-2 could land and take off from anywhere: roads, fields, forest clearings. It didn't need prepared airfields, which meant the regiment could operate from improvised bases close to the front lines. The women of the 588th would turn the Po-2 into a weapon of terror through tactics, not technology. The regiment's commander was Major Yevdokia Bashanskaya, an experienced pilot known for her calm demeanour and tactical brilliance. Under her leadership, the night bomber tactics evolved rapidly during training. The regiment would operate in complete darkness, navigating by landmarks, compass, and sheer nerve. They would approach targets at extremely low altitude, sometimes below 300 feet. They would cut their engines before reaching the target, gliding silently to the release point. The Germans would hear only the wind whistling through the wing struts, that soft whooshing sound, before the bombs fell. Then came the most dangerous part: restarting the engine while pulling up from the bombing run, often while under anti-aircraft fire, in complete darkness. Each crew consisted of 2 women, a pilot and a navigator. The navigator sat behind the pilot, responsible for map reading, target identification, and releasing the bombs. Communication between them was nearly impossible over the engine noise, so they developed a system of taps and signals. Trust was absolute. It had to be. The training accidents were inevitable. Women died learning to fly at night without instruments. They died in crashes during landing practice. They died when training bombs detonated prematurely. Each death was devastating to the tight-knit regiment, but they pushed forward. The front was getting closer every day. By May 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was declared combat-ready. They received their orders, deploy to the southern front, where German forces were pushing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The women packed their few belongings, said goodbye to Engels airfield, and flew south to war. None of them knew if they would survive their first mission. Most assumed they wouldn't. They were wrong. They would become legends. The 588th arrived at the front in June 1942, just as the German summer offensive was gaining momentum. Operation Blue was underway, a massive push towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Soviet forces were in retreat across a 1,000-mile front. Into this chaos flew 40 Po-2 biplanes, crewed by 80 young women. The veterans of the all-male bomber regiments watched them arrive with undisguised skepticism. Women flying combat missions, in training planes? It seemed like madness, or worse, a propaganda stunt that would get them all killed. The women of the 588th felt the doubt, the condescension, the leering comments. They ignored it all. They had a job to do. Their first mission came on the night of June 8, 1942. The target was a German headquarters complex near the front lines. 3 planes would go. The women, dressed in their flight suits, pulled on their leather helmets and goggles and walked to their aircraft through the darkness. Ground crews, all women, finished loading the bombs and wished them luck. Lieutenant Irina Sebrova climbed into her Po-2's pilot seat. Behind her, her navigator checked the maps one last time. The engine coughed to life, that distinctive popping sound of the 5-cylinder radial. Sebrova felt the familiar vibration through the stick. She took a deep breath, released the brakes, and rolled forward into the night. The flight to the target took 30 minutes. They flew low, following roads and rivers to navigate. There were no lights anywhere, no landmarks except what the moon revealed. The night was their cover and their enemy. Sebrova's hands were steady on the stick, but her heart hammered in her chest. This was different from training. This was real. As they approached the target area, searchlights suddenly stabbed into the sky. The Germans had heard them coming. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, tracers arcing up in lazy streams that seemed slow until you realized each glowing dot was moving at supersonic speed. The sky erupted in fire and metal. Sebrova cut her engine. The Po-2 became a glider, silent except for the wind through its struts and wires. She pushed the nose down, diving toward the target. The navigator counted seconds, watching the target grow in the darkness. At the last moment, she released the bombs. 4 50-kilogram bombs tumbled away. Sebrova immediately hauled back on the stick and hit the starter. The engine caught, sputtered, then roared back to life. She pulled up hard, feeling the fabric wings strain as explosions lit up the ground below. Tracers followed them, but the Po-2 was already turning, diving, weaving. The searchlights lost them in the darkness. Sebrova's hands were shaking as they flew home, but she was grinning. They had done it. They had struck the enemy and survived. Behind her, more Po-2s were already approaching the target. The 588th's tactic was harassment. Multiple planes attacking the same target throughout the night, one after another, never giving the enemy rest. Sometimes they would make 8, 10, even 15 sorties in a single night. As soon as a plane landed and was refueled and rearmed, it would take off again with the same crew or a fresh one. The ground crews were essential to this operation. These women, also members of the 588th, worked through the night in all weather, refueling planes by hand pump, loading bombs that weighed nearly as much as they did, patching damage, repairing engines. They worked by flashlight or moonlight, often under German artillery fire. Without them, no planes would fly. That first night, all 3 aircraft returned safely. The women were exhausted, exhilarated, terrified, and proud. They had proven they could fight. But combat reality set in quickly. 2 nights later, they lost their first crew. The plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and exploded in mid-air. 2 women, barely 20 years old, died instantly. The regiment mourned them, painted their names on the memorial board, and flew again that same night. The losses continued. A week later, another crew was shot down, then another. The Germans had realized these night raiders were more than a nuisance. They were a genuine threat. Anti-aircraft defences were reinforced. Fighter patrols were increased. The Luftwaffe began dedicating resources to hunting the night bombers. The women adapted, they flew lower, they varied their approach routes, they became more cunning. Experienced crews developed their own techniques. Some would fly in pairs, with one plane drawing searchlights and fire while the other attacked from darkness. Others would deliberately fly loud approach patterns to focus attention, then cut engines far from the target and glide in from unexpected angles. The regiment's bombing accuracy improved dramatically. They could drop bombs on targets the size of a house from 300 feet in complete darkness. They destroyed ammunition dumps, fuel depots, supply columns, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. They disrupted German rear areas so consistently that enemy units couldn't rest, couldn't resupply effectively, couldn't sleep. The psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers never knew when the night witches would come. Every night brought fear. Every engine sound in the darkness meant potential death. Morale suffered. Soldiers on the Eastern Front began requesting transfers away from sectors where the night bombers operated. By the fall of 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had become the most active bomber unit on the Southern Front. Some crews were flying 15 to 18 missions per night, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm. The women existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion, snatching sleep between missions, eating when they could, living with the constant knowledge that any sortie might be their last. The German military began taking them seriously. Wehrmacht intelligence units tried to identify and track the night bomber bases. Rewards were offered to any pilot who shot down one of the Po-2S. The Iron Cross was authorized for any German who killed a night witch. But the bombers were maddeningly difficult to intercept. German fighter pilots discovered that engaging Po-2S was almost suicidal. The biplane's maximum speed of 94 miles per hour was below the stall speed of most German fighters. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, trying to slow down enough to engage a Po-2, would stall and crash. Pilots who tried to dive on them found the little biplanes could turn inside any attack, disappearing into valleys or tree lines. Several German fighters were lost attempting intercepts, crashing in the darkness, or stalling at low altitude. The 588th's survival depended on more than their tactics. It depended on the extraordinary skill and courage of individual women who became legends within the regiment. Nadezhda Popova was one of the deadliest. She would eventually fly 852 combat missions, more than any other pilot in the regiment. Night after night she climbed into her Po-2 and flew into hell. She was shot down multiple times, once crash landing in no man's land and escaping back to Soviet lines on foot. She flew with shrapnel wounds, with frostbite, with fever. She never stopped. On one mission, German fighters caught her during the approach. Machine gun fire ripped through her plane, tearing the fabric, splintering the wooden frame. Her navigator was wounded. The control stick was barely responding. Popova kept flying. She pressed the attack, dropped her bombs on target, and somehow coaxed the shattered aircraft back to base. Ground crews counted 42 bullet holes in the plane. She flew again the next night. Irina Sibrova, another pilot, would complete 1,008 missions during the war. She became known for her ice-cold composure under fire and her ability to hit targets with uncanny accuracy. Once, she was tasked with destroying a German searchlight position that had been particularly effective at catching night bombers. She flew directly at the searchlight, waited until it locked onto her plane, then dropped her bombs while blinded by its glare. The bombs destroyed the position. She flew home with spots in her eyes that lasted for hours. Yevdokia Nosal and her navigator, Yevdokia Rakitina, formed one of the most effective crews. They developed a technique of approaching targets in a steep dive with the engine cut, making them almost impossible to hear or see. They would release bombs from extremely low altitude, sometimes below 200 feet, then restart the engine and climb out through their own explosions. The danger was extraordinary, the accuracy devastating. But not everyone survived. The losses mounted steadily. Lieutenant Vera Bellick and her navigator were shot down over German lines. Both survived the crash but were captured. The Germans executed them. Lieutenant Yekaterina Ryabova was killed when her plane collided with a German night fighter. Lieutenant Rufina Gasheva and Olga Sanfirova were both shot down on separate occasions but managed to evade capture and return to Soviet lines after days behind enemy lines. By early 1943, the 588th had become integral to Soviet operations on the Southern Front. They supported the defense of Stalingrad, flying missions every night even in terrible winter weather. They supported the Caucasus Campaign, the liberation of Crimea, the advance into Poland. Wherever Soviet forces fought, the night witches flew. The Germans came to recognize the sound, that soft whooshing through wing struts and wires. Nachthexen. The soldiers would shout warnings, scramble for cover, fire blindly into the darkness. Sometimes they hit nothing. Sometimes they got lucky and brought down a plane. But the bombers kept coming, night after night after night. Soviet propaganda embraced the night witches. They were perfect heroes, young, brave, fighting against enormous odds. Newspapers ran stories about them. Newsreels showed them preparing for missions. They became symbols of Soviet resistance and determination. But the women themselves had little time for propaganda. They were too busy flying, too exhausted, too focused on survival. The regiment's unofficial motto became simple. We fly, we bomb, we go home. No glory, no dramatics. Just the mission, over and over, until the war ended or they died. Most expected to die. The casualty rate was too high to expect otherwise. They wrote letters home that might never be sent. They treasured photographs of families they might never see again. They formed bonds with each other that went beyond friendship, beyond sisterhood. These women trusted each other with their lives every single night. The winter of 1943 brought new horrors. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. The women flew in open cockpits with minimal protection. Frostbite was common. Pilots would land with their hands frozen to the control stick, their faces covered in ice. The ground crews worked in conditions that would have shut down any normal military operation. Fuel had to be heated before it could be pumped. Bombs had to be de-iced before loading. Engines refused to start. The women kept flying. On the night of January 31st, 1943, Lieutenant Yevgenia Jigulenko flew her 15th mission of the night. She was on her final approach to a German ammunition depot when multiple searchlights caught her. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately. Her plane was hit, the engine smoking, fabric tearing away. She could have aborted. She could have dumped her bombs and tried to escape. Instead, she pressed the attack, diving straight down through the fire. She released her bombs directly over the target and pulled up so hard the wings nearly separated from the fuselage. The ammunition depot exploded in a fireball visible for miles. Jigulenko's plane, trailing smoke and fire, barely made it back to base. She landed more or less successfully, though the plane was completely destroyed on touchdown. She walked away, reported mission success, and asked when she could fly again. She would eventually complete 773 combat missions and survive the war. But not everyone was so lucky. On August 1st, 1943, the regiment suffered its worst single night. 4 crews were shot down in a coordinated German ambush. 8 women died. The regiment mourned them, painted their names alongside the others on the memorial board, and continued operations. There was no time to stop, no time to process the grief. The mission continued. Some women broke under the strain. It would have been impossible not to. Flying multiple missions every night, seeing friends die, living with constant fear and exhaustion, it was too much for anyone to endure indefinitely. Some requested transfers to other units. Some were medically evacuated for psychological trauma. There was no shame in this. What was remarkable was how many stayed, how many kept flying no matter what. Nadezhda Popova once explained it simply. We flew because our country needed us. Our men were dying, our cities were burning. How could we not fight? The regiment's tactics continued to evolve. They began coordinating closely with ground forces, providing direct support for offensive operations. They would fly missions just ahead of advancing Soviet troops, bombing German defensive positions minutes before assaults began. The accuracy and timing required was extraordinary. A mistake could mean bombing their own soldiers. They rarely made mistakes. One of the most remarkable aspects of the 588th was that it remained an all-female unit throughout the war. Other Soviet women's regiments had gradually integrated men as casualties mounted and replacements were needed. The 588th refused. When pilots or navigators were killed, they were replaced by other women. When ground crew positions opened, they were filled by women. Major Bashanskaya insisted on maintaining the regiment's identity, and somehow she made it work. This wasn't about proving a political point. It was about maintaining the unique culture and tactics that made the regiment effective. The women had developed their own methods, their own communication systems, their own understanding of how to survive. Integrating men might have disrupted that, so they stayed all female, and they stayed deadly. By 1944, the tide of war had turned. The Red Army was advancing west, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Germany. The 588th advanced with them, operating from temporary airfields in newly liberated territory. They flew missions over Poland, then East Prussia, then finally Germany itself. The women saw the devastation the Nazis had inflicted. They flew over burned villages and destroyed cities. They saw the liberation of concentration camps. Whatever questions they might have had about the necessity of their mission vanished. They had been fighting to defend their homeland. Now they were fighting to destroy the evil that had invaded it. The bombing intensified. The 588th flew missions every night, weather permitted. Some crews were flying over 20 missions per night now, landing only to refuel and rearm before taking off again. The exhaustion was beyond description. Some women fell asleep standing up between missions. Others flew in a semi-conscious state, operating on pure muscle memory and instinct. On January 31, 1945, Lieutenant Rufina Gasheva and her navigator Olga Sanfirova completed their 800th combat mission together. 800 times they had climbed into a Po-2 and flown into darkness and fire. 800 times they had returned. They were among the most experienced crews in the regiment, legends among legends. Both would be named heroes of the Soviet Union. Throughout 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, the 588th continued operations. They bombed German positions during the final assault on the city. They flew support missions for Soviet troops fighting street to street through the ruins. Even as Germany collapsed, the Night Witches kept flying. The war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew its last combat mission on May 4th, striking German positions near Berlin. When the ceasefire order came, many of the women were in the air. They landed to find the ground crews crying, celebrating, unable to believe it was finally over. The statistics were staggering. The regiment had flown 23,672 combat sorties. They had dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on German targets. They had flown the equivalent of circling the Earth 4 times, and they had done it in obsolete biplanes made of wood and fabric, without radios, without armour, without guns. 32 women from the 588th were killed in action, dozens more were wounded. But compared to other Soviet bomber units, their casualty rate was remarkably low. This wasn't luck. It was skill, tactics, and the unbreakable bonds between the women who flew together. 23 members of the regiment were named heroes of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honour. Many others received the Order of the Red Banner, the Order of the Red Star, and other decorations. Major Yevdokia Bashanskaya, who had commanded the regiment from its formation to the war's end, received the Hero of the Soviet Union award. She had flown alongside her women, shared their dangers, and never asked them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. But victory brought unexpected challenges. The women had spent years as combat pilots and warriors. Now they were expected to simply return to civilian life, to become wives and mothers and workers, to forget the terror and exhilaration of combat. Many struggled with this transition. Nadezhda Popova returned to aviation, becoming a flight instructor. She married a navigator she had served with, and they named their son after a fallen comrade. But she never forgot the nights over the Caucasus, the searchlights, the tracers, the sound of her engine cutting out as she glided toward a target. She would wake up at night hearing that sound, that soft whooshing that had terrified the Germans. Irina Sebrova became an engineer. She rarely spoke about the war, even to her family. When asked about her service, she would say only that she had done her duty. But in her study, she kept a photograph of her crew, young women in leather helmets and flight suits, standing beside a battered Po-2. She would look at that photograph sometimes and remember what it felt like to be invincible. Yevgenia Jigulenko became a filmmaker. She eventually directed a movie about the Night Witches, determined to tell their story before it was forgotten. But she found it difficult to capture the reality on film. How do you show what it was like to fly 15 missions in one night? How do you convey the terror and exhaustion and pride? She did her best, but she knew the real story could never be fully told. The Soviet government, for all its propaganda about equality, largely ignored the Night Witches after the war. They were briefly celebrated, then forgotten. Male veterans received preferential treatment for jobs, housing, and education. The women veterans were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to have served and then quietly fade away. Many did fade away. They married, raised families, worked ordinary jobs. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't wear their medals. They tried to forget, but they never really could forget. The bonds formed in combat don't break. The women stayed in touch, visited each other, remembered together. They attended reunions where they could speak freely about what they had experienced, where they didn't have to explain or justify or minimize. These reunions became sacred, a place where night witches could be night witches again, if only for a few days. As the decades passed, the story of the 588th slowly emerged into wider consciousness. Historians began interviewing the survivors. Books were written, documentaries were made. The world began to learn about these incredible women who had fought in history's most terrible war. But by then, many of the night witches were gone. Nadezhda Popova died in 2013 at age 91. Irina Sebrova died in 2000. Yevgenia Jigulenko died in 1994. One by one, the generation that had flown through fire and darkness passed away, taking their memories with them. Today, only a handful of night witches remain alive. They are in their late 90s or older, the last living links to an extraordinary chapter of history. When they are gone, we will have only the records, the statistics, the second-hand accounts. But their legacy endures. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment proved that courage has no gender. They proved that determination and skill matter more than physical strength. They proved that women could fight and die for their country as effectively as any man. They proved it every night, in the darkness over the Eastern Front, with bombs and bravery and obsolete biplanes that should never have been in combat. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches, and meant it as an insult, a way to dehumanize an enemy they couldn't defeat. But the women of the 588th embraced the name. They wore it with pride. They were witches, and they brought nightmares to the Wehrmacht. When we think of World War II, we think of massive tank battles, strategic bombing campaigns, great generals, and pivotal moments. We think of D-Day and Stalingrad, of Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. We remember the big picture, the sweeping narratives of nations at war. But history is also made by individuals, by young women who volunteered to fly obsolete aircraft into darkness and fire, by ground crews who worked through the night in freezing temperatures to keep those aircraft flying, by commanders who believed in their people when everyone else doubted. The story of the Night Witches is ultimately a human story. It's about what people can achieve when pushed to their limits. It's about courage that goes beyond physical bravery into something deeper, a refusal to accept defeat or diminishment. It's about women who were told they couldn't fight and responded by becoming some of the most effective combat aviators of the war. Their aircraft were primitive. Their tactics were improvised. Their losses were real and devastating. But they never stopped flying. Night after night, mission after mission, they climbed into their Po-2S and went to war. They terrorized an army that had conquered most of Europe. They earned the respect of their enemies and the gratitude of their nation. And they did it together, as women, as sisters, as comrades. The Night Witches flew 23,672 combat missions. But that number, as staggering as it is, can't capture what it really meant. It can't convey the fear of every takeoff, the relief of every landing. It can't show the exhaustion of flying 15 missions in one night, of climbing out of the cockpit and immediately preparing to fly again. It can't express the grief of losing friends, the trauma of watching planes explode, the nightmares that followed. Numbers can tell us what happened. They can't tell us what it meant to the women who lived it. Today, their story is finally being told more widely. Films, books, and articles are bringing the Night Witches to new audiences. Young women around the world are learning about these incredible pilots and finding inspiration in their example. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment is taking its rightful place in the history of World War II, but we should remember that these women never sought fame or recognition. They flew because their country needed them. They fought because their people were suffering. They risked everything because it was the right thing to do. That's what makes them heroes. Not the missions or the medals or the statistics. It's the simple decision, made over and over again, to climb into that cockpit one more time, to fly into the darkness one more time, to trust your navigator, your aircraft, and yourself one more time. The last Night Witches are leaving us now. Soon, no one will remain who remembers what it was like to cut your engine over a German position, to glide silently toward your target with your heart pounding and your hands steady on the stick. No one will remember the sound of wind through wing struts, the soft whooshing that made the Germans whisper Nachthexen in the darkness. But the story will remain, the example will endure. The Night Witches showed us something important about human potential and courage. They showed us that heroes come in unexpected forms, that the greatest achievements often come from the most unlikely sources. They were young women, most barely out of their teens, flying antique biplanes against the most powerful military machine in the world. They shouldn't have succeeded. By all logic and military doctrine, they should have been annihilated in their first weeks of combat. Instead, they became legends. They were the Night Witches, and they never stopped flying.